Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into Yukio Mishima's 1956 masterpiece, The Temple of the Golden Pavilion, or Kinkakuji. This isn't just a classic of Japanese literature, it's a profound, beautiful, and deeply disturbing meditation on what happens when an ideal, absolute beauty collides violently with a fractured world.
It's arguably Mishima's most perfect novel, precisely because it uses a real, dramatic historical event to conduct a complex philosophical interrogation. What we need to understand immediately is that the novel is not a simple historical account or, a crime procedural. It is what we might call an aesthetic ethical experiment.
That's our mission today. We are going to explore how Mishima took an act of seemingly random vandalism, a young monk burning down one of Japan's most revered national treasures, and transformed it. He turned it into this complex allegory that asks crucial questions. How does something as beautiful as the Golden Pavilion become a target for violence? And what does that act of destruction tell us about the spiritual sickness of post-war Japan?
And we're really going to focus on three major themes to get there.
Right. The violence of beauty, the illusion of subjectivity, and that paralyzing post-war meaning vacuum.
To ground this, we really have to start with a fact. On July 2nd, 1950, Kyoto's magnificent 14th century Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion, was set ablaze and largely destroyed. And the perpetrator was a young novice monk, Hayashi Yukin.
And this is where Mishima made his critical literary leap, isn't it? The real monk confessed a strange, almost poetic motive, jealousy of the Golden Pavilion's beauty.
Which the contemporary newspapers were just baffled by. They called the motive incomprehensible.
But Mishima saw a deeper truth in that incomprehensibility. He largely ignored the police reports, the objective details.
Right. He chose instead to focus solely on the internal logic of that confessed jealousy. He recognized a spiritual syndrome here. The worshiper who is oppressed by a beauty that is too perfect seeks liberation only through its total destruction.
And that act for Mishima was the perfect manifestation of the spiritual sickness pervading Japan after the war.
So let's firmly establish the novel's position. Mishima uses the 1950 arson as, well, the outer shell of his story. But the text itself is an intense, extended first-person confession. We are trapped entirely inside the mind of the protagonist, Mizuguchi.
And that form is so crucial because it allows Mishima to deeply excavate the twisted psychological motivations that led to the crime.
It is an act of profound literary transformation. Mishima consciously moves away from social realism. He wasn't interested in the historical facts of the novice monk's life as much as he was in the concept of that life.
So he took that real culprit's motive, the jealousy of the beauty, and just elevated it.
He took it from a singular, strange anecdote into a universal psychological symptom.
That distinction is key. This isn't documentary, it's conceptual. The entire novel is designed as a deep dive into the specific logic that leads someone who worships something to conclude that they must destroy it.
And that leads directly to the core conceptual themes driving this experiment. We've already mentioned the violence of beauty. This is Mishima examining how absolute aesthetic perfection acts as a psychological tyrant.
And the second theme, the illusion of subjectivity. In Japanese, it's shutaisei kankaku.
Yes, and this is the protagonist's desperate and ultimately mistaken belief that an act of extreme defining destruction is equivalent to personal freedom, that he's seizing control of his destiny.
And finally, the atmosphere that makes all of this possible, the post-war meaning vacuum. This is the spiritual crisis that resulted from the total collapse of the traditional value system, the imperial myth, the rigid structure of society after Japan's defeat. It left individuals like Mizuguchi just spiritually adrift.
Therefore, the ultimate positioning of the Temple of the Golden Pavilion is that of an allegorical work of ideas, a kanenteki bungaku gua. It is a relentless exploration of the destructive logic that emerges when aesthetic ideals and personal violence intersect during a period of historical and spiritual rupture.
It's asking a huge question. If the sublime is proven false, where does the idealist turn?
To properly analyze this novel, we need to utilize Mishima's framework of the two times, which helps separate the narrative from the commentary.
Okay, so let's start with the narrative time, the internal reality of the book.
The novel's internal time extends chronologically from the protagonist Mizuguchi's difficult childhood during the end of World War II. It continues through the immediate post-war period and the American occupation, and it concludes with the 1950 arson.
So the whole scope details how Mizuguchi's intensely isolated and psychologically troubled development. His trajectory from suppression to nihilistic despair is just intimately intertwined with the massive, chaotic societal change Japan was undergoing.
His internal breakdown mirrors the external collapse.
So that's the internal experience, but the writing time, the external context, is just as important, isn't it? The novel was published in 1956.
Yes. Tell us why that specific year matters so much.
Well, 1956 is a milestone year. This was the moment the Japanese government's economic white paper famously announced, "Economically, we are no longer post-war."
So materially, Japan was recovering rapidly, and the Golden Pavilion itself had been dutifully rebuilt in 1955.
So on the surface, everything looked fine. Prosperity was starting, tradition was physically restored. But Mishima, by choosing to revisit the traumatic 1950 incident in 1956, aimed to expose the spiritual fracture that persisted beneath that veneer of material recovery.
Exactly. He was saying, look at the shiny new economy, look at the rebuilt temple, but don't ignore the rot beneath. The spiritual crisis wasn't merely the immediate trauma of defeat, it was the persistent meaning vacuum.
Right, and the fractured value system that remained because tradition had collapsed before new democratic values had firmly taken root.
The foundation was shaky, even if the facade was golden.
To truly conduct this deep dive, we need to use the 3 explanatory layers or levels of interpretation that the source material suggests. We can't just read the story.
We have to contextualize it.
We begin with the historical fact layer. Here, we focus on the objective environment Mizoguchi lived in.
The impact of the total war mobilization, the experience of defeat, the occupation regime.
And the specific institutional changes and reforms that shaped his daily life. This provides the concrete, inescapable pressure points.
Then we move to the literary mechanism layer. This is the scaffolding of the book.
We analyze the structure, the first-person psychological monologue, and the complex symbolic system Mishima employed.
The Golden Pavilion as the absolute ideal, Mizoguchi's physical defect, the stutter as the symbol of his internal block.
And the concepts of beauty and ugliness as defining poles.
And finally, the conceptual theme layer. This is the highest level of analysis. This is where we extract the core philosophical paradoxes driving the action, the specific destructive relationship between beauty and violence, the pervasive feeling of moralized shame, and the ultimate ethical collapse that makes the crime possible.
Only by integrating all 3 layers can we avoid reducing the novel to just a psychological case study or, a purely abstract philosophy.
We have to step back and realize Mizoguchi was forged in a crucible. His adolescence occurred under the rigid total war system of the late WWII era.
And this system didn't just affect the front lines, it fundamentally restructured every aspect of civilian life.
It created the intense, constant pressures that directly shaped his internal world.
So let's start with the material control and scarcity. Following the 1938 National General Mobilization Law, people experienced strict rationing and coupon systems for virtually all necessities.
Rice, sugar, soy sauce, salt, clothing all were tightly controlled. The slogan, "Luxury is the enemy, Zataku wa tekida," wasn't just propaganda.
It dictated existence.
And this wasn't just inconvenience, it was a state of chronic, sustained deprivation. By 1944 and 1945, severe food shortages meant many citizens were in a state of semi-starvation, relying heavily on low-quality substitutes.
Things like wheat bran, bean dregs, sweet potatoes.
Exactly. Chronic malnutrition and relentless fatigue were standard features of daily life.
Now, look at the psychological impact on Mizoguchi. This material poverty, this gnawing dissatisfaction with physical reality, it just fueled his intense hunger for something absolute.
He desperately needed a beauty that completely transcended the physical, corruptible world of scarcity and ugliness.
And the distant, perfect, golden ideal of the Kinkakuji became the sole recipient of all his unmet needs and idealized projections.
Next, consider the labor and education mobilization. Normal schooling. It just ceased to be a primary focus.
High school students were pulled into labor mobilization in factories and fields.
And even primary school children were sent to the countryside, the gakudu shukai, for evacuation and labor, interrupting their natural development.
This had devastating consequences for someone like Mizoguchi. His essential youth experience was truncated and distorted.
This interruption intensified his pre-existing social isolation and awkwardness. He lacked the social environment to develop healthy coping mechanisms or relationships.
So he was forced to retreat even further into his internal fantasies about the Golden Pavilion as his sole sanctuary from reality.
Finally, we examine the pervasive propaganda and moral judgment. The wartime machine sanctified virtues like absolute obedience, sacrifice, and endurance.
We're talking about intense, almost suicidal concepts like 100 million broken jewels, ichio kugyukusai.
where total national sacrifice was the ultimate moral imperative. Schools were geared toward creating loyal little nationals, shukokumen, dedicated to the emperor.
This is the context that created the toxic pool of shame that Mizoguchi swam in. This wartime moral environment established a brutally rigid collective evaluation system.
And Mizoguchi's physiological defects, his debilitating stuttering, his weak health, were immediately interpreted within the system as signs of an unqualified subject or a kakushimen.
In effect, his physical disability wasn't just a personal hardship, it was a moral flaw against the state.
And that led to an indelible sense of inferiority, a deep moralized shame.
He felt like he carried a crushing, unpaid debt to his parents and the nation for being structurally defective in a system that demanded perfect, obedient sacrifice.
The pressure was relentless, not just from the government, but from the person next door.
And this was enforced through the Tonorigumi system, right? The neighborhood associations.
So Sonrigumi, yes. This grassroots governance network that grouped 10 households together.
And it was designed for mutual aid distributing rations, organizing air defense, but its most potent function was mutual surveillance.
It created an inescapable pressure mechanism. Individuals were constantly seen and judged by their neighbors. There was a system of collective responsibility where one family's perceived failure or misbehavior was instantly considered the shame of the entire neighborhood, or chinai no haji.
Imagine living under that kind of constant scrutiny. This generated an atmosphere of social terror.
People were fearful, repressed, and public spaces allowed only the surface behavior, the tane.
Genuine, true feelings, the han, had to be carefully concealed for survival.
For Mizoguchi, already struggling with a speech defect, this environment was catastrophic. Under such severe collective scrutiny, his stutter made him an instant outcast.
A target of exclusion and ridicule, he was just unable to maintain the necessary tatame.
So he retreats. He is forced to withdraw entirely into his internal world, doubling down on his fantasies.
The Golden Pavilion becomes the sanctuary, the single place free from the judging gaze of the neighborhood, the school, and the nation.
And his inherent physical weakness was thus magnified by the social pressure into a crippling existential shame.
So let's summarize how these environmental factors created Mizoguchi's psychological state.
The mechanism of nationwide conformity, which demanded perfection and sacrifice, made him feel like an unqualified person from childhood. This generated profound internalized guilt and relentless self-reproach.
And the wartime context transformed his physiological defect, the stutter, into a moral stain, reinforcing his deep-rooted inferiority complex.
He couldn't live up to the national ideal of the selfless subject, making his shame a political and ethical burden.
And this naturally led to the powerful bipolar value projection.
Because the real world, his family, his community, his nation, systematically rejected him and deemed him insufficient, he was compelled to project all his emotional, spiritual, and aesthetic needs onto a single, remote, absolute idol.
The Golden Pavilion.
The Golden Pavilion. This was the only way he could maintain a fragile sense of existence and worthiness.
The war ends in 1945, but the psychological and ethical environment doesn't just reset, it enters a new phase of chaos.
The defeat didn't just change the map. It fundamentally destabilized Japan's entire sacred national narrative, plunging society into a profound ethical vacuum.
The faith collapse was instant and total. The emperor's 1946 Humanity Declaration, that crucial event where the emperor essentially declared he was not a living god.
Exactly. And the GHQ's ban on militarism and state Shinto completely hollowed out the sacred narrative.
The language of the sublime, the heroic concepts of sacrifice, everything that had been deemed worthy of dying for, failed overnight.
Slogans like Imperial Nation or 8 corners of the world under one roof became ridiculous relics. The psychological vacuum this left behind was immense. People lost the shared foundation of belief.
This is where Mizoguchi steps in with his defining alternative mechanism. He had to fill that void.
He privately sanctified the Golden Pavilion. It became his personal sacredness, an eternal, trustworthy value that superseded the national myth which had just betrayed and collapsed.
This was his last desperate attempt to find meaning.
And post-war Japan entered what we call an ethical gap. The highly structured, top-down subject ethics of the imperial era had vanished.
Yet the necessary replacement citizen ethics, rooted in abstract democracy, individual human rights, and autonomy, had not yet taken hold.
This led to a stark ethical division in society. On one side were the serious reconstructionists advocating for shutase, subjectivity.
These were the intellectuals grappling with war responsibility, attempting to build a new, autonomous moral judgment for the nation and the individual.
And on the other, you had the cynics and decadents, often called the Buraiha.
Figures like Sakaguchi Ango, whose theory of decadence, Darakuron, argued that the true liberation after the war was simply returning to base desires and indulging in vice.
If the sublime was hypocrisy, then only the vulgar was authentic.
And Mizoguchi is perfectly caught in the chasm between these two worlds.
He failed to establish a healthy shutaisei. He couldn't achieve personal autonomy or rational moral judgment. But his intense, burdensome idealism, coupled with his deep shame, prevented him from fully embracing cynical, decadent indulgence.
He couldn't successfully reconstruct, and he couldn't successfully degenerate.
This double failure drove his isolation and psychological instability to a fever pitch. All his contradictions and resentments had nowhere to go except onto the destruction of the Golden Pavilion, the one symbolic object left that represented the tyranny of the impossible ideal.
And beyond ethics, physical life itself was fractured. The post-war reality was defined by social disorder, extreme poverty, runaway hyperinflation.
The dominance of black markets, the amashi, and the practical failure of governmental control.
To put this simply, rations were delayed, cut, or non-existent. Survival often meant operating outside the law.
The black market was the real economy. This collapse of legitimate social order created a profound crisis of trust. Why trust rules when they fail to feed you?
Long-term planning became impossible.
And this widespread social disorder is crucial because it psychologically lowered the barrier for extreme behavior.
When your world is already lawless, when people rely on illegal trade just to get rice,
the impulse to gain control through a violent, destructive act like arson seems less unthinkable. Mizoguchi felt he was already operating in a universe where the rules had been suspended,
where everything would become lawless.
So we have these two major societal responses running parallel. The Reconstruction path was serious, intellectual, and focused on building a new nation.
Through the new constitution, democratic reforms, and the Shutaisei debates, it demanded responsibility and effort.
And the relief valve path offered immediate escape. This was the rapid rise of sensory consumption, the quick recovery of the entertainment industry, dance halls, movies,
and the pervasive popularity of decadent literature. It was a mass psychological decompression chamber.
But Mizoguchi was the ultimate misfit. He was incapable of the social engagement and autonomy required by the serious Reconstruction path.
Yet, due to the paralyzing weight of his idealist baggage and moral anxiety stemming from his wartime experience, he couldn't find genuine comfort or release in the decadent escapism.
He was excluded from all viable paths toward meaning. Consequently, all his unresolved psychological conflicts and his inability to cope with the era were concentrated and then destructively externalized onto the Golden Pavilion.
For him, the temple became the physical embodiment of the unbridgeable gap between the era's grand, failed ideals and its squalid, impossible reality.
Post-war Japanese literature was wrestling with enormous themes: the experience of defeat, national responsibility, the quest for a new meaning, and overwhelming nihilism.
And Mishima's approach was brilliantly unique. He consciously avoided direct political discussion about military defeat or democratic transition,
choosing instead to transform the profound social and spiritual issues into an aesthetics versus ethics conflict.
He used aesthetic concepts, beauty, ugliness, light, dark, as the primary battleground to explore post-war nihilism and the desperate effort for reconstruction.
And this makes Mizoguchi not merely a psychologically troubled character, but a literary clinical diagnosis. He is a concentration of the era's spiritual symptoms: an overwhelming desire for absolute value, deep shame, profound inferiority, a paralyzing distrust of reality,
and ultimately confused self-destructive action. The novel, in effect, maps the internal illness of the age onto the disturbed soul of one young man.
Let's revisit the concept of shutaisei. It was the crucial post-war term.
It meant the capacity for independent, self-directed judgment and action, free from external authority, no longer relying on the emperor or the dictates of the military regime.
It was the intellectual core of democratic rebuilding.
And what's fascinating is that Mishima's novel doesn't celebrate the emergence of shutaisei.
No, it demonstrates its spectacular failure and distortion.
Mizoguchi fundamentally mistakes destruction, the arson, for an act of liberation and autonomy. He imagines that by burning the temple, he is finally seizing control of his own destiny and acting as a free agent.
And this is the core of his pseudo-subjectivity.
The action looks active, but it's driven entirely by passive despair. He believes he is achieving martyrdom or a grand defining act, but it is merely acting out a desperate fantasy.
And Mishima embeds the ambiguity in the novel's conclusion. The fact that Mizuguchi, after the fire, explicitly does not commit suicide.
He runs away, lights a cigarette, and says, "I want to live."
That implies the fundamental bankruptcy of his illusion. The arson was a desperate, pseudo-active gesture, but it led only to greater emptiness.
Literary critics like Kobayashi Hideo focus heavily on this paradox. Why didn't he complete the act?
Mishima uses Mizuguchi's survival to expose the failure of his self-declared martyrdom.
And the general literary atmosphere of the time was defined by an anti-heroic, anti-sublime mood, often expressed through decadence, self-mockery, and self-dissolution.
Dazai Osamu's No Longer Human is the iconic example of this.
But Mizuguchi is distinct within this landscape. He is not a pure cynic.
No, he pathologically clings to the concept of the sublime, which is embodied by the Golden Pavilion.
His friend, Kashiwagi, who encourages him to use perverse schemes and mock all ideals, represents true nihilistic cynicism, the post-war relief valve personified.
Kashiwagi tries to pull Mizuguchi toward self-indulgence and pragmatic cruelty, suggesting he shed his crippling idealism.
But Mizuguchi can't do it. The tragic root of his action is that because the sublime, the imperial myth, the wartime ideals, failed him in the real world.
He sought refuge in the absolute beauty of the temple, only to be crushed by its oppressive perfection.
This forced him toward violence against the ideal itself, rather than simple, cynical indifference.
Mizuguchi was a man with an unbearable burden of idealism, operating in a world that had emphatically declared all idealism bankrupt. This created an impossible psychological tension that had to resolve itself destructively.
Now we shift focus to the cultural environment, but we must issue a critical warning here.
The concepts we are about to discuss, mono no ware, hanatatame, kirininjo, provided resources and materials for Mizuguchi's psychological expression.
But they were not the direct deciding causes of the arson.
Absolutely. The arson was driven by a synthesis, individual pathological obsession, amplified by the societal meaning vacuum and focused onto a single symbolic object load.
So he twists these cultural concepts to rationalize his private pathology.
Let's start with the impermanence aesthetic, or muju.
Traditional Japanese aesthetic centers on this concept of impermanence. It teaches acceptance of the transient nature of things like cherry blossoms or the long history of the Kinkakuji itself.
This transience, mono no ware, is the source of poignant beauty. The traditional response is gentle appreciation and acceptance of decay.
But Mizuguchi rejects this gentle acceptance entirely. This is his dangerous reversal.
He attempts to monopolize beauty and control impermanence by actively manufacturing destruction.
This paradoxical logic is terrifying. He sees the Golden Pavilion falling into mediocrity, filled with common tourists, its master concerned only with profit.
He fears the slow, inevitable spiritual decay more than physical destruction. So he chooses to end it himself.
Seeking to achieve a perceived eternal existence in the magnificent preserved instant of its destruction.
He weaponizes the concept of muju. He uses the cultural idea that transience is beautiful to justify irreversible violence, attempting to transform his deep aesthetic regret into an act of ultimate aesthetic control.
It's an intellectual pathology, dressed up in traditional garb.
Now let's talk about Han and Tatme.
The cultural separation between public facade, Tatme, and private true feelings, Han, was severely pronounced in post-war Japan. People were intensely guarded, especially under the occupation.
And Mizuguchi's stuttering becomes the perfect, tragic, physiological metaphor for this fracture.
His speech defect symbolizes the absolute communication blockage between his inner truth, his Han, his obsessive fantasies, his profound shame, his hatred of the Golden Pavilion's oppressive perfection.
And his ability to express any of this outwardly. His Tatme.
He was utterly unable to articulate his internal crisis in a way the world could understand or tolerate.
So when language fails completely, that long-suppressed Han must erupt. The arson is the devastating, uncontrolled outburst of his true feelings.
When his attempts to praise the temple's beauty always felt inadequate, violence became his final, extreme, irreversible form of expression.
And Mizuguchi's tragedy is also one of profound social and relational failure, rooted in the traditional tension between Giri and ninja.
Social obligation and human emotion. He failed on both counts.
On the Giri level, he failed his fundamental social contract. He disappointed his parents, and crucially, his master denied him the inheritance of the temple duties.
This was a total rejection by the community of obligation, accelerating his sense of worthlessness and isolation. He had no social role.
On the ninja side, he lacked any true intimate relationships. His friend Kashiwagi was purely a manipulator, encouraging his worst impulses.
And the most devastating example, which illustrates how the Golden Pavilion consumed his life, is the moment he attempts intimacy with a woman.
That scene is key. At the moment of potential connection, the image of the Golden Pavilion flashes into his mind, causing sexual failure.
The temple, his idol, literally crushes all natural human emotion and intimacy.
The total collapse of his relational network meant he had nowhere to ground his identity or his emotions.
So he clung desperately to the Golden Pavilion as his sole symbolic object, projecting all his unmet needs, obligations, and resentments onto this single external structure.
So to summarize this section, cultural factors are narrative material, not the direct cause of the arson.
The tragedy results from a powerful combination of forces: individual pathological obsession multiplied by societal meaning vacuum, multiplied by symbolic object load.
Cultural factors merely provided the template, the temple as a symbol, and concepts like impermanence, for Mizoguchi's unique pathology to act out its destructive internal logic.
It's vital we note that Mizoguchi misapplied these cultural concepts. He took peaceful wisdoms like Zen acceptance and twisted them into a rationale for violence.
The cultural frame didn't make him do it. It gave him the language to justify doing it.
Mishima was a meticulous writer, and his interest in the Kinkakuji incident was not sensationalism. He was drawn to its profound intellectual possibilities.
The intersection of aesthetic ideal and absolute despair. He consciously transcended documentary realism.
And this adaptation involved two major transformations. First, the motive conceptualization.
Mishima elevated the real-life motive of jealousy into a universal conflict between absolute beauty and the protagonist's fragile right to exist.
He charted a detailed psychological progression from intense devout worship through agonizing jealousy and finally to inevitable destruction.
Second, the event symbolization. The arson ceased to be just a crime against property. It became a powerful symbol of betrayal and destruction aimed at an absolute value representing tradition, aesthetic purity, and collapsed authority.
This transformation elevates the novel from a case study into a monumental metaphor for the spiritual condition of post-war Japan.
And Mishima used Mizoguchi's voice to deliver several crucial philosophical warnings. Let's start with the most dramatic, the violence of beauty.
Mishima argues that when beauty is idealized to the point of being absolute, it ceases to be a comforting inspiration and becomes a tyrant that oppresses ordinary, flawed people.
It acts as an impossible standard against which the worshiper constantly judges himself, always falling short.
This internal oppression leads to self-judgment and ethical collapse. Mizoguchi perceives the Golden Pavilion's beauty not as art, but as a constant tinnitus or oppressive measure.
And this psychological burden pushes him toward ruthlessness and disregard for fundamental human ethical concerns, including the real-world danger he posed to others during the fire.
He was so consumed by the aesthetic ideal that the capacity for simple goodness or empathy just evaporated.
Next, we have the illusion of subjectivity. Mizoguchi is convinced his act of arson is an act of obtaining freedom and destiny control, a profound, pseudo-active gesture.
He believes he is finally seizing his life, creating a rebirth through fire.
But Mishima exposes the lie. The action was driven by passive despair and accumulated psychological pressure, not by true autonomous ethical choice.
And Mizoguchi's survival, which we discussed earlier, questions the validity of his new life, suggesting he simply exchanged the illusion of worship for the deeper spiritual wasteland of meaningless destruction.
Destruction is not liberation.
Third, the meaning vacuum. The post-war rupture left the individual adrift. The old national myths were gone, and the new democratic values were too abstract to provide an anchor.
When Mizoguchi saw the temple being secularized, turned into a mere tourist attraction, he felt even that final sacred ideal was collapsing.
The individual response to this existential vacuum, Mishima suggests, is often projection and destruction.
The individual projects all their internal conflict, shame, and societal frustration onto a symbolic scapegoat, the Golden Pavilion, and seeks to resolve the complex internal crisis by destroying that external object.
This act is a desperate revelry that ultimately fails to address the root problem of the spiritual vacuum.
And finally, the dangerous reversal. Mizoguchi attempted to control impermanence Muju by actively manufacturing its destruction,
trying to seal the beauty into an eternal moment of glorious, self-defined climax.
This is the ultimate paradox. Any attempt to master natural law and seal eternal beauty through violence is both dangerous and absurd. It leads only to mutual destruction.
And the complete loss of the very beauty that was sought. Mishima warns that you cannot possess transience by forcing its hand.
The novel's power lies in its synthesis of Mishima's enduring personal and intellectual concerns.
The ideal of pure beauty, the profound link between decisive action and self-defined death, and the pathology of the individual mind in a turbulent, fragmented era.
And it's crucial to recognize Mishima's selectivity. The real-life incident could have been interpreted politically,
A communist act, a protest against militarism.
or purely through a Buddhist lens. Mishima deliberately focused on the beauty, inferiority, destruction, psychological logic line.
This aligns perfectly with his consistent interest in conceptual experimentation and the mechanics of extreme will, using the crime as a perfect vehicle for his own intellectual obsessions.
To understand Mizoguchi's descent, we must trace his psychological journey through the novel's 3 clear phases.
Okay, let's start with phase 1, idolatry. Beauty as the lifeline.
This phase covers Mizoguchi's traumatic childhood, defined by physical weakness, stuttering, and severe poverty. His dying father tells him the legend of the Golden Pavilion, billing it up as the epitome of perfect, unassailable beauty.
And he first sees it in 1944.
The psychological mechanism here is pure transference and escapism. The more oppressive and humiliating his reality, the stuttering, the poverty, the shame,
The greater his desperate need to cling to an absolute transcendent object to support his fragile self-esteem.
and the Golden Pavilion, miraculously surviving the heavy wartime bombing, became his unsullied beauty.
It represented the invincible ideal and hope in a time of chaos. It was his spiritual safety net, his religious totem against the darkness of the war.
But then we move to phase 2, cursing, beauty as the judge.
The reality check begins post-war. Mizoguchi becomes an apprentice monk at the temple, but he finds the reality disappointing.
The temple is increasingly secularized, swarming with common tourists, and his master is commercially minded. The physical proximity to the imperfect reality of the temple only increases his alienation.
The psychological shift is profound and dangerous. The unbridgeable gap between the absolute perfection of the beauty he had idealized in his mind and his own shame and perceived ugliness intensifies his self-loathing.
And worship slowly curdles into hatred, a deep, frustrated adoration.
He begins to externalize the shame. He starts to believe that the beauty is actively mocking and oppressing him, transforming the Golden Pavilion from a sanctuary into a tyrant.
And the best illustration is that sexual failure scene. The temple becomes a literal psychological barrier to normal life, making him believe the idol is cursing his entire existence.
The symbolic meaning transforms completely. The Golden Pavilion is no longer a benevolent ideal. It becomes a cold, oppressive authority.
A symbol of an inhuman, unattainable scale, a constant instrument of torture, judging his every failure and defect. It must be overthrown for him to breathe.
And that leads to phase 3, destruction, arson as pseudo-liberation.
This is the phase where all the tensions break. Triggers stack up. The cynical encouragement from Kashiwagi, the crushing realization that he will not inherit the temple duties.
And the perceived desecration of the temple by American soldiers. He executes the arson in the summer of 1950.
His psychological mechanism becomes entirely focused on irreversibility and control. He is convinced that destruction is the only solution and the ultimate means of seizing control over a world that has always controlled him.
This leads to the great moment of illusion. He believes the arson is an active decision, a violent rebirth that allows him to seize control of his fate, finally escaping the paralyzing shame and powerlessness that defined his youth.
He feels that unprecedented lightness and says, "I want to live."
But Mishima's final insight is that this is the bankruptcy of the subjectivity illusion. The fire brings no true freedom, only deeper nihilism and spiritual desolation. He has destroyed the symbol, but he remains a prisoner of meaningless destruction.
So after this comprehensive exploration, we circle back to the core thesis of Mishima's work.
In the profound context of the post-war meaning vacuum, the absolute idealization of beauty by an individual pathologically gives rise to destructive violence.
And the subsequent attempt to pursue shutaisei, or subjectivity, through that violence is merely a greater illusion.
For Mizoguchi, the absolute beauty he sought shifted from being his salvation and his spiritual anchor to becoming his deepest nightmare.
And the concept of freedom transformed from decisive constructive action into a phantasmal mirage seen through the flames. His act of burning was tragic because it was a desperate external attempt to resolve an internal spiritual crisis.
And we established that cultural elements are essential, providing the symbolic vehicle, the kinkakuji, and the expressive structure of the experience.
But culture is not the simple cause. The event is a complex composite product driven by individual pathological obsession, multiplied by societal rupture, multiplied by symbolic projection.
Mizoguchi misapplied cultural concepts, which generally teach acceptance, peace, or resilience, to rationalize his pathological need for destruction.
He took the tools of wisdom and wielded them as weapons of nihilism.
The novel's universal message is a potent, enduring warning about any era of value fragmentation.
It shows how isolated individuals project their accumulated personal failures and deep societal fractures onto a powerful, absolute symbol, clinging to the desperate, false belief that its destruction will bring freedom or clarity.
The novel ultimately suggests that true liberation and genuine subjectivity come not from attacking external symbols, traditions, or structures, but from the far more fundamental and difficult task of rebuilding internal moral frameworks.
And confronting one's own darkness, and truly grappling with the difficult dilemmas of the time. Mizoguchi's fate is a comprehensive cautionary tale against ever mistaking destruction for resolution.
So if Mizoguchi was driven by the paralyzing fear that beauty would slowly decay into mediocrity, and he chose to destroy it in a glorious instant to preserve its memory, does that resulting emptiness, the absolute void of having no ideal left, make the act of survival more unbearable than the slow, natural process of ruin he tried to prevent?
That is the essential, terrifying paradox Mishima leaves us with. And it raises an immediate question for you, the listener. What external symbols in our world today carry such heavy, absolute symbolic weight, whether they represent tradition, progress, or national identity, that their destruction might be mistakenly viewed by the alienated individual as a necessary path toward personal liberation or a final resolution of internal despair?
The search for genuine reconstructive meaning is always infinitely more difficult than the simple final act of burning.